Okay, welcome everyone to Brownfields Basics, Part 2. I hope you were all able to join us last time. If not, no worries. We do have that recording available, so we can share that with you when we share this recording and these slides. So before we get started, I do want to cover a couple housekeeping items. The first being, you're probably going to have questions. We encourage your questions. You can pop your questions in the chat. I know many of you are familiar with Zoom at this point, so go ahead and pop your questions in the chat. We will be responding to those questions at the end, though some of them we will respond to in the chat as they come up, depending on the question, of course. So if you have questions on a particular slide, the slide numbers are located in the bottom right-hand corner of every slide. So just keep track of that slide number and let us know what slide you'd like to go back to. This is a Zoom meeting, so please be careful to keep yourself muted so we don't have any disruptions. This recording, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing that recording with you along with the slides post-broadcast. So you will all receive an email with those materials. Okay, I think that's enough of the housekeeping. Helen, next slide, please. Okay, well, I'm really excited to introduce today's presenters. We've got some really experienced folks here. So we're going to hear from Noemi Emmerich Ford from EPA Region 9, Mariam Tosnif Abbasi from the Department of Toxic Substances Control, Greg Schaefer from the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and our own Ignacio Dayrit from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Next slide, please, Helen. Okay, so what we're going to discuss today, here's a really quick agenda. We're going to do a little recap, talk about where the brownfields are, what funding is available, how you work with regulatory agencies, how do you build reuse partnerships, how much funding is available, and how can you apply? I know everyone's really excited for that part, so we're going to get into that, and how you can access free assistance, both as it relates to ECRG and beyond. Okay, so I'm actually going to hand it off at this point to Mariam.
Great, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much to all of you who've taken the time to join us today. I hope that we do have some of you who did participate in our part 1. As Claire said, that slide deck and presentation is available for any of you who didn't and want to learn more about what we discussed then. And I'm going to do a really quick recap on what we covered last time. You know, the biggest question I think that we really got into last time in a lot more detail are, you know, what are brownfields? So we are looking at brownfields as vacant or underutilized parcels, which are thought to be or known to be contaminated. But our emphasis on brownfields is that these are properties where incentives can encourage investment and where reuses of the land can be revitalizing and spur economic growth, make communities safer and healthier spaces for everyone who lives, works, and plays there. We also talked a lot about overcoming brownfield challenges. One of the key things, I think it was Ignacio who covered this last time, was how to organize a team and get together all the stakeholders, develop a vision on what this land can be, how to break down the work into more manageable phases, get a sense of how much the environmental work and other work is going to cost, and to identify funding. And so today's topics that Claire just showed to us on the previous slide really is going to get into some of the details on how to address some of the brownfields. We're going to focus on working with regulators and really spend some significant amount of today's time talking about funding. Next slide, please. So with this, I'm going to turn this over to Greg Schaefer, our statewide brownfields coordinator, who's going to answer the question on where to find the brownfields.
Thanks, Mariam. And this is a question we get a lot of the time, especially when we talk about funding that's available in terms of grants or loans that we have offered for redevelopment purposes. But there's not always a simple answer for where are the brownfields. But I think the easiest answer is that each regulatory agency has their own database for tracking or just keeping some basic information on some of these sites. So some of these databases include US EPA's Cleanups in My Community Maps and Lists, which is a nationwide database for tracking some of that information. And then California has two major systems. One is called Envirostore, which is managed by Dtsc, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and then GeoTracker, which is managed by the Regional Water Quality Control Boards here in California. If you are working outside of California, your state regulatory agency, environmental regulatory agency, more than likely has its own mapping system. And there is some variability between these systems just in terms of what kind of information is presented online and that sort of thing. So it always gives you a really good starting place for some either basic site information or basic contact information for a staff person assigned to that case that can answer your questions or provide additional information. Some other important sources of information would be planning and zoning departments at the local level. So your cities or counties may have specific zoning plans or planning documents that outline where some of these brownfields may currently be located, or areas where heavy industry has previously been a part of the city plan. California also has or previously had these organizations called redevelopment agencies, which were dissolved, I believe, in 2011. And part of that dissolution of those agencies required that they create long-range management plans, which includes site lists for sites that they had designated as blighted and needed redevelopment specifically for brownfields. And a last but very important source of information is just local and community knowledge on past uses. So the community that you're working in may have information from past workers that used to work at facilities in the area that may have gone unnoticed over time, or they were historically there and got redeveloped a long time ago before regulatory agencies came to fruition and did this kind of work. So it's always important, excuse me, it's always important to include local and community planning in your processes. Next slide, please. This is just a quick screenshot of DTSC's Envirostore database. So when you get to the landing page, initially you'll see the search bar on the top left side of the slide, where you can either search a site name or a facility name or an address. If you type the address in directly, it's going to give you this Google Map overlay that you see on the bottom right, and it will be an interactive map that you can zoom around, zoom in and out, pan side to side, and then if you click on any of those various colored boxes, it will give you a little pop-up with the site name and address. And if you follow that link, it will take you to a site-specific profile where you can find additional information on California sites. And GeoTracker is set up the exact same way and houses cases for the Regional Water Quality Control Boards as well as local California agencies. Like I mentioned, there are going to be some differences if you're working outside of California, just on the types of databases and the information presented. Next slide, please. I believe this is Claire's.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So we're going to be talking a lot more about some specific sources of funding later on in the presentation, but we wanted to provide you with this overview slide right off the bat. You should use this as a resource. All of the blue text, those are links to specific websites and resources for you to look further into. I want to highlight some of the EPA sources of funding, MARC, TBAs, or multi-purpose assessment revolving loan, and cleanup. Noemi's going to talk more about that. Targeted brownfield assessments, job training grants, 128A funding. Mary Ann is going to talk a lot more about ECRG, the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, later on. That round 2 funding cycle is opening mid-January. And then I did want to highlight some of the other sources over here. It's really important to understand that in funding brownfield redevelopment and land reuse, it's important to layer your funding. That's how you're going to get your project funded. And so these are some other programs that we wanted to specifically highlight that can support brownfields reuse projects, including programs that come out of the Strategic Growth Council, like Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities, transformative climate communities, climate change research. All of these support affordability, livability, climate change, and EJ. California State Water Resources Control Board, including the Site Cleanup Sub-Account Program and Orphan Site Cleanup Fund, which, like ECRG, are state funds for assessment and cleanup of groundwater. And then finally, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, their infill infrastructure grant program is also worth checking out. Then you've also got USDA, iBank, Caltrans, and California Parks, which have unique programs that can help you finance for infrastructure, sustainable transportation planning, trails, habitat conservation, all of that as it relates to brownfields redevelopment. So come back to this slide, you'll get these slides, you'll have access to these links, and it looks like my colleague Rujane just posted the full catalog of California funding opportunities in the chat. Go take a look at that as well. They're working on a 2022 version right now, so stay tuned for an updated version. All right, I'm gonna pitch it back to Marianne, or maybe actually Greg.
Oh, actually, you know what? I'll go ahead and take this one. Thank you, Claire.
Mhm.
So one of the things that came out in our poll when we did part one of this webinar series was that a lot of the audience members had very little understanding, maybe not a lot of experience with brownfields. And so we adjusted a lot of the content we're providing today to really go as basic as possible and look at things from a different perspective, from the perspective of someone who perhaps is interested in brownfields through their work or through their organization and is trying to start the process of reducing environmental uncertainties to take that land and bring it to something more purposeful, useful for the community. And so we talked about, usually the first step, this is something that Greg talked about, is identifying a site, understanding the intersectionality between potential sources or reasons why that site may be impacted by contamination, but also it's overlaid with redevelopment and reuse desirability, that there's infrastructure there, there's a need there, there's a community desire to see that piece of land be brought to a higher and better use. And so first step, identify that site. On your own, there are a lot of resources, including the databases that the state databases that Greg talked about, Envirostore and Gear Tracker. Research current and past uses. A lot of professionals who are in real estate really know how to do this quite well by using free resources. If based on doing the research, there is an understanding that there may be some past uses to be concerned about, or uses in the area that cause some concern, bring on an environmental consultant to conduct a phase 1 environmental site assessment or a preliminary endangerment assessment. These are first stage type of environmental assessments that can be done without collection of samples or anything more complicated, but a lot of desktop research goes into these types of documents to help someone understand what the actual environmental conditions are at their site. And then if environmental issues are identified, then it's our recommendation that you bring on a regulatory agency. Next slide. So I'm going to just say some words and then turn this over to Greg. Working with a regulatory agency, I know sometimes make people intimidated, and it feels like it's a big and difficult process. And we're here to tell you that it's easy. It is something that's achievable and can really provide a lot of value in your journey to take a site and bring it to safe and healthy and productive reuse. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, who's going to talk to us about the different ways you can engage with a California regulatory agency.
Thanks, Marianne.
Hey, Greg, do you mind if I jump in with a poll real quick before you get started?
Oh, yes, please do.
Awesome. All right, everyone, I'm just going to go ahead and launch a quick poll just to get your input on have you worked with an environmental regulatory agency before? Yes or no? Just really straightforward. Go ahead and fill that out. I want to see how many of you. Okay, letting everybody weigh in here. Okay, all right, I've got enough here. All right, so Most of you, yes, but about a third of you, no. So here's the results here. So yeah, I would say about 2/3 of you, yes, and 1/3 of you, no. All right,
Great.
I'll let you carry on, Greg. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. So some of this may be new information for you, even though you have done some regulatory agency or worked with a regulatory agency before. California is, I think, uniquely structured because we have a handful of different regulatory agencies that have some overlapping authority. So here in California, we have 3 major categories. You can work with the regional water quality control boards, which primarily have jurisdiction over protection of waters of the state, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, who handles hazardous materials, and then there are also local oversight agencies, which have a variety of jurisdictions that were delegated from various state authorities. Basically, maybe your environmental consultant or your organization has worked with one of these regulatory agencies in the past, so they may have a preference on which one they go to. But ultimately, the agencies all talk amongst each other. So whenever we get an application for a new oversight case, we always talk to our counterparts at the other agencies to make the determination on which agency is best equipped to handle the specific case. So we always recommend that you can go in with whoever your preferences, or maybe whoever you have experience working with, but ultimately the agencies will make that determination. It is important to note that California is structured specifically for brownfields to be a fee-for-service agreement. So you will get into some sort of voluntary agreement with these agencies, and then you will be responsible for paying the oversight costs for them. In the state of California, these agencies typically do not do the work themselves, so you will retain your environmental consultant to actually perform the work, the sampling, assessment work, or cleanup work. And then your regulatory agency will review work plans and review reports and recommendations and direct your environmental consultants that way. The end goal is typically a no further action letter, meaning that all of the appropriate assessments or all of the appropriate cleanup actions have taken place at the site, and that the regulatory agency considers everything to be complete, and that, quote, no further action is required based on the identified environmental concerns. Next slide, please. And this is for Miriam.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you for explaining the roadmap of what different agencies you could possibly work with in California. There are choices, but like Greg said, they are, we all try to work with each other to make sure that the site is assigned to the agency that's the best fit to manage the work there. Now, I wanted to walk everyone through very, very broadly our investigation and cleanup process. When you are working with a regulator on a site that is a brownfield or is thought to be contaminated, there is a process that you have to go through. The first step is getting into an agreement with the agency. This diagram is available on our website, and we use it really to kind of summarize our process. But the process implemented by the local agencies and by the water board is generally similar. Getting into an agreement, having a discussion on what the work is going to be for the site. The first step is the evaluation or the investigation step. There are different documents that Dtsc uses to package the environmental investigation and investigation results. But generally, it is broken down in a work plan where your environmental consultant will write a work plan, which basically describes what the work is going to be for an investigation. How many samples are they collecting? What are the samples going to be analyzed for? Where are the samples going to be collected? And there's a rather intense sort of science that goes behind answering those questions and coming up with that work plan that I don't want to really get into right now because that's a whole universe unto itself. But the bottom line is that the way the investigations work is that there's work plans are implemented, a report is written, handed into the regulatory agency approves that report and makes determinations for the next step. Oftentimes, there are many situations where once you complete an investigation, that's an end point and no other work is needed. Sometimes investigation goes in a loop where you do some investigation and then you may need to have several iterations of an investigation before you get to that end point, which could either be you're done, going into the no further action endpoint that Greg talked about, or it could go be recommended for cleanup because there's enough contamination there that it has to be addressed somehow. And that takes us to our remedy selection box over here, where we have the consultant develop another work plan that talks about how the cleanup is going to be conducted and what level it's going to be cleaned up to. Usually for DTSC's process, when we get into that cleanup phase, it is accompanied by a public comment period, which is the way we engage communities in the work that's being conducted in their area and ask them to review these work plans and provide comments. And we also have to comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, which essentially is a law that we have to comply with to ensure that we identify the impacts of the cleanup and make sure that any negative impacts are mitigated and addressed. The cleanup is then completed, it's implemented, and there may be some other deeper dives. That design documents may be needed, more detail may be needed than what was put in the initial work plan, and the consultant then gives us a report that tells us how the cleanup was conducted, and we, if all the data is provided is sufficient, we approve that. After the cleanup, you could end up in a similar endpoint, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in one of my later slides. But you can either be done with the cleanup completely, or there may be certain provisions that we have to incorporate and maintain longer term. So this is essentially the investigation and cleanup process. There's a lot more to this than what I'm talking about today, but I'm really trying to provide our audience today with sort of like a high level understanding of what this process is. And this is fairly universal for any of the agencies you'd be working with in California. I do want to do a plug for deeper information. We have a collection of 1-page, 2-page documents on several of these different components, all housed in our quick reference guides. And I have a hyperlink here. So when you do get a copy of this presentation, you can go and learn more about the requirements and the actions related with these different phases of work for a brownfield. Next slide, please. So this was another, I think for me, a little bit of a different perspective in providing this information. Once again, looking towards an audience that is trying to learn more about brownfields and who are looking at things from a different perspective. I thought this was a really important way of answering a question. When you do enter into an agreement with a regulatory agency, what are the kinds of information that the regulators are looking for? And what answers do they need in order for you to be done, with that relationship and kind of move on to the reuse and the more tangible work of getting that property into a reuse that can be beneficial for the community. So here's what we're looking for. We first want to identify the contaminants of concern and what media are affected. So we generally start out based on the early assessment, maybe before we even have sampling, we start out with a list of chemicals of potential concern. And as we go through the investigation process, those chemicals of potential concern turn into chemicals of concern because those are the ones that we want to chase and learn more about. And we want to know what media are affected by these contaminants. Is it the soil? Is it the groundwater? Is it the soil vapor? In certain cases, surface water may also be a media that may be impacted, maybe even sediment. So the first question regulators want to have answered are, what are the contaminants and what media are affected? When we have those answers, then we move into how deep and how widespread is the contamination. It's something in the business we commonly refer to as lateral and vertical delineation of the contamination in the various media. So a lot of the iterative investigation that I spoke about in my previous slide, that is how we go through the process of delineation. We always want to know if there is an existing source at the site, or if that source has since been removed and we're just dealing with the residual impacts of this source. And so through that process of identification and delineation, a lot of the answers that the regulators are looking for is to identify that source. Once we have a handle on the contaminants and the media and the extent of the contamination, we want to answer questions on risk. And we look at risk in two separate boxes, and I'll update this when we send these slides out to everyone. But we want to understand how people are being exposed to the contaminants. Does the contamination have a complete exposure pathway? Exposure pathways are something that you'll see in these environmental documents, because it's really important for us to understand what the route of exposure is. And we also want to know if the environment is being impacted by the contamination. Is the contamination getting into our groundwater resources? Is it getting into sort of contributing to general like air quality? And we also look at flora and fauna to see if the contaminants have a complete exposure pathway to various aspects of the environment. And so these boxes don't necessarily work one after the other. We answer these questions sort of in tandem with each other, and every piece of information we get kind of feeds into updating what we call a conceptual site model, which integrates all these different pieces of sources and geology and hydrology of the site, and what the contamination movement is, and who's being exposed to this contamination. So we then look at solutions, what needs to be done to address the contamination to make the site safe. There are long-term protections, and we always want this to be as collaborative as possible to balance our need for health and safety with the reuse plans. Next slide, please. The end goal of working with the regulator is to get to no further action. And I wanted to go through very quickly what the different no further action points are, because it's always not very clear. One is just sort of outright. We've done the investigation, we've done the cleanup, and nothing more is needed. Sometimes we have investigation and cleanup that lead to conditions. So conditions like the site can only be used for commercial or industrial purposes, or if there is some kind of like barrier in place, then it has to be maintained. And there may be other special conditions like a special use, like a park use that may be a little bit different than a residential use or a commercial use. When we have these no further action with conditions, there are long-term perpetual requirements in place to make sure the land is being used and is compatible with what our endpoint decision was. So this could mean deed restrictions and long-term operation and maintenance plans. And as someone who's a brownfield stakeholder, it's important to really compare the cost of an unconditional no further action, which is sort of the easiest and has no carrying costs, with the cost of longer term stewardship that is going to go on in the long term. And that's it for this slide. Next slide, please. With this, I'm going to turn it over to Ignacio. Ignacio, it's all yours.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. And I'm going to move quickly because we're already falling behind. But regardless of where you are, whether you're a developer or community member, really have to work with your local government, because your plans, your projects, your programs will somehow end up with the local government. And the local government's role is really wide, quite extensive, because your local government has different arms. You have legislative arm of your local government. you have planning, you have building, you have public works, you have the housing department, or depending on your local government, you're going to have all these aspects, and they have to create plans. You have a general plan. The general plan has different elements: housing, environmental justice, infrastructure. Uh, there are about 13 or 14 required sections there. So, and many of your projects touch one or two of these plans. Local government either develops and or implements these plans, or they work with the community or the private sector to implement these programs and projects. And so you need partnerships. These projects don't happen by themselves or by one entity. And even if it's uh, a private project, it still needs input from all sectors of the community. And all these projects need infrastructure. You just don't put a building there and expect that the road or the park or the lighting will come. Uh, and many of these projects do not come with the funding to fund the support infrastructure and any mitigations that may be needed to accommodate any of the impacts of these projects. And so local government also comes with some tools to provide financial assistance, whether from local government or from supporting grant applications. And so a local government can have different roles in this. They can support projects also. They have some incentives they can throw at projects. But local government's resources have really been shrinking over the past few years. Local governments can also catalyze the reuse themselves by acting as a developer or really becoming a key partner, getting more involved in projects. So a local government can play various roles. So if you're a local government, you might get all these questions, and some local governments have the resources to do these, some don't, and that's where your other partners come in, including CClear. But going on to the next slide, uh, who are the partners? Well, there are other federal governmental partners. You got the EPA and other federal agencies. You got the state, and I'm not just talking about Dtsc. I'm talking about other state partners, because there you might have a transportation component, a housing component, an open space component, an EJ component, and there are many state agencies involved in these different disciplines. You have regional agencies, councils of government, economic development districts. You have your regional and statewide nonprofits that work on different issues. County Local governments themselves, again, have different departments, and you have special districts. So depending on your project, you may need all these partners. Community-based organizations, the neighborhood groups, the faith-based organizations, they're the ones, we've been talking about high level, but in the end, these are local projects that affect people where they live, where they work, where they play. And even the question about the question posed about even soil, testing soil. Well, that gets very complicated, but imagine what CDC had to go through to provide us COVID test that was reliable. We're asking the question basically asks, can we have a soil test that is going to be accepted by all regulatory agencies? That's a very complicated thing. And again, that's where this dialogue comes and how we come up with these types of solutions that meets everyone's needs. Other partners include the local businesses, some property owners, merchants groups, chambers of commerce. You have universities that have been taking the lead in some projects. The types of use that will be involved in these projects, the consultants, environmental consultants included. Sustainability is very important these days with climate change and resiliency. Where's the money coming from? Banks have been traditionally mentioned, but a lot of these projects are funded in a community sense, and these are where the community development financing um, entities come in, because you need that component in your financing. And of course, who's going to build it? The for-profits and the nonprofits, if it's not the local government themselves. So that's just that's all the partners, and you need to have uh, good connections with all these stakeholders or community to have a successful project. So I'm going to hand it off now.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. So what I want to talk about, and I'll do it quickly, is US EPA's Brownfields funding. And given what you just heard earlier, our funding is really to help you get at receiving a no further action letter from your certified regulatory agency. And then also by utilizing our funding, helping you establish those partners within your community by assisting you in building a Brownfields program. So what are Brownfields grants? We have funding for a variety of different types, for conducting environmental assessments, for doing remediation, for establishing a revolving loan fund where you would receive a grant and then could give out loans and subgrants, or forgivable loans to entities to be able to do remediation, and then also environmental job training, funding that would assist in providing the necessary certifications and training to have individuals work at sites within their community. We also have technical assistance that we can provide where we have contractors on retainer that can assist you with doing cleanup, assessments, reuse planning, and it's directly through assistance provided by EPA. So it's not funding directly to you. The other, which you've heard a little bit about from Miriam and Dtsc, is they also have Brownfields grants through their Equitable Community Revitalization program. And they'll talk a little bit more about that. It's about $250 million in grants, which is used for very similar to EPA's funding around assessments and cleanups. And they're specifically focused on areas that have experienced disadvantage or those that have been historically underserved in California. Our funding goes across Region 9 in California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, and the 3 Pacific Islands, and then of course, all tribes. The next round of ECRG funding will begin in late 2002. US EPA's request for applications is currently available, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So there are other public funding opportunities. Ignacio hit a little bit on kind of having collaboration with other partners. So depending on where you're planning to do your redevelopment, there are historic preservation grants that are available for those who are planning to sustainably reuse buildings. You can also tap into housing and urban development, community development block grants. That is the only federal funding that can be used as a match against US EPA grants. You can also look into tax increment financing districts. Of course, with which I'm sure you've all heard of now, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which has put in a ton of infusion of resources from several federal agencies to assist with brownfields, the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we have other federal partners who can provide assistance, such as the Department of Interior, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, specifically if you're looking to focus on climate change mitigation or anything around renewable energies, and Department of Transportation. And this would be really helpful with Department of Transportation right now with the infrastructure funding, if you're looking to build out your transportation to be more sustainable or meet other areas. Next slide. So speaking directly to EPA's funding, because we're a federal agency, we love acronyms, we call it MARC, which stands for the various grant types that we have, our multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup. As I mentioned, the RFP is open and it will close on November 22nd. I'm going through this very quickly. There will be which will hyperlinked at the end of the presentation, another webinar that US EPA is hosting on Thursday. We'll go through each of these grants a little bit more in depth. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of what we do offer, this is a quick slide that will tell you the amounts that we have available, the number of awards that we're planning, understanding that this is drafted, will depend on what we receive when the applications close on November 22nd. But here's what we have in mind. You can see it gives each of the different grant types, the maximum project period, meaning how long you can keep the money, and in order to spend the grant awards, what the amounts are, how many awards we expect to make, and then the total that we'll have, because we not only have bipartisan infrastructure funding, but we also still receive our regular appropriated funding. Next slide. And then who's eligible? So just to give you an idea, states, tribes, and nonprofits are really the those that are eligible. And then we just qualify. There's always questions about what does local government mean? So quasi-governmental entities that have been developed, such as sanitation districts or larger regional planning authorities, all sorts of regional council of governments, groups of general purpose, redevelopment agencies. For a nonprofit, it has to be a 501c3. For qualified community development entities, it's a 45 Dtsc1. Individual entities, for-profit organizations, or nonprofits that have a taxation under the 501c3 those are not eligible to receive Brownfields funding. Next slide. And so just to give you some idea for those who might be familiar with US EPA's Brownfields funding, since we offer this, it's an annual award that's offered, and we've been doing this since 2002. Typically, our multi-purpose and revolving loan funds are offered every other year because we have infrastructure funding. They are both being offered this year, as you saw from the earlier slide. And as you also saw from that slide, we have 3 different types of assessment grants available: our community-wide, our state and tribal, and our assessment coalition. Our assessment coalition means there's one applicant with 2 partners that would be joining that one applicant. That applicant needs to be a county, state, or tribe that's applying. And then those other partners cannot have the capacity to manage a grant on their own, and therefore are not able to apply for any of the other resources that I've talked about. New communities are encouraged to apply. We really are trying to reach communities that have been historically underserved or those who have not received assistance from us in the past. There is an enhanced state letter that's required for cleanup grants. And so if you are planning to apply for a cleanup grant, make sure that you talk with Dtsc to receive that letter from them. Competitive procurement, that's always been part of our process, but we are leaning in on ensuring that competitive procurement is done not only to the federal standard, but to your own policies and procedures. Again, our cleanup grants, higher amounts than in the past, are being funded up to $2 million. And just understand, if you're applying for EPA funding, that the majority of activities really should be around environmental activities. Even though we allow for other activities, the majority still needs to be environmental. Next slide. And then just to give you an idea of our anticipated timeline, of course, again, we're the federal government. We are not quick. If you apply for a grant in November, on November 22nd, the funding would not be available to you until somewhere between July and October of 2023. We plan to make the announcements in May, and we'll work with you throughout the next fiscal year to implement those funds. Next slide. And then just something really quickly that's not part of our grant program. I mentioned technical assistance, where we have contractors on retainer. For those who do not have a Brownfields program and do not have the capacity to apply for a grant, but may be interested in 1 or 2 particular sites, but don't have the capacity to hire an environmental contractor, we have what's called our targeted Brownfields assessment program. It's a rolling application, first come, first serve. It's 3 pages that's located online that you can fill out. Again, it's contractor assistance. It's not a grant. It's to conduct, for our contractors to conduct a phase 1 or phase 2 for you, to give you an idea of what the extent of contamination is so that you can move forward with redevelopment. We are looking for projects where there's near-term redevelopment, where you're working with communities with environmental justice concerns, that the project will serve a public good, that you do already have some leverage funding for redevelopment in place. And we typically limit that funding to about $100,000 per site, but given that we have bipartisan infrastructure funding, we can go a little higher. Next slide. And then just lastly, I talked about the technical assistance, and this is just to give you a list of, it's not only that we can conduct assessments for you, but there are other types of technical assistance that we can provide. All kinds of market feasibility studies, infrastructure evaluations, transportation studies around a redevelopment, helping you look at climate resiliency and looking at making a project even greener and making sure that you sustainably reuse it. community engagement, bringing in the community to be able to create a community vision around an area, labor market analysis, just a variety of things that we can do through contractors that we have already on retainer that will assist you in implementing your redevelopment. Next slide. Okay, and so with that, I think that's it for EPA, and I will turn it over to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Noemi. I'll go ahead and jump into this then. I'm going to be going through the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant. This is part of a larger initiative where we got funding in 2021 for the Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities Initiative, which has several different moving parts to it. So we've got discovery enforcement that's focused on dry cleaning, a few other smaller programs that are more community oriented that are in the process of being built out. The whole goal of this initiative is to prioritize sites in vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. I'm not even going to go over this. This is really more of a resource for you to be able to access at a snapshot if you want to learn about the other programs we have in the CVCI. Next slide, please. So the thing I do want to focus on today is what is the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant? We are in round 2 right now of 3 rounds where we had $270 million for reimbursement grants. We allocated about $75 million in our first round, and about $100 million is available in the next round. We're in our sort of pre-app process right now, and the application should be available sometime in January of 2023. The grant is available for public entities, nonprofits, and tribes to conduct community-wide assessments, investigations, or cleanups, and it's an online application, and it's a competitive process. Next slide, please. So how do we find disadvantaged areas? So there's a database, and you can explore that database called CalEnviro. Screen through this link once you have the slides, where they have layered pollution burden data and demographics to come up with a score. And so anything that's 75 or higher is what we consider to be a disadvantaged area. And our focus in the ECRG is to get money into these communities. For communities with lower scores, those are disfavored in the application process, but we still do entertain them because we recognize that vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations can exist in any area of the state. And that's just something that we will definitely consider as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the basics are that public entities, tribes, and nonprofits can apply for up to $350,000 to conduct an area-wide or community-wide assessment. Site-specific investigations range from $80,000 to $3 million. Cleanups go up to $7 million. There has to be a reason why you believe that the site is or may be contaminated, and there must be plans that incorporate equitable development principles. It's really something that we are asking for in the whole sort of national conversation on looking at disadvantaged communities and making sure they get equity. This grant for us is really highly focused on equitable development to make sure that the reuses are made available to the community who already lives in those spaces. The funding term is about 2 years. As I mentioned, when I said it's a reimbursement grant, it means that there's no lump sum that gets exchanged. Payments are conducted by a reimbursement process. Regulatory oversight is required, and this is a real sort of deep dive. We've got content just on circular liability defense, but you can't be the polluter when you are asking for our funding to conduct this work. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of round 1. As you can see, there's a lot of concentration of our awardees in these Northern California and Southern California urban areas. And we really would love to see these red dots expanded and distributed more evenly throughout the state. And so in round two, we're really making an effort to speak with potential applicants in the Inland Empire, in Northern California, far Northern California, in Imperial Valley and South California, just so we can get this money out to a wider geography. Next slide. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm assuming that most of our audience may be not that familiar with what we did last year, but we do have some changes between round 1 and 2. We won't do a pre-application, but we are going to be releasing a self-check tool for potential applicants to use the self-check tool to really understand what documents they need to gather and what they need to do to establish themselves as an eligible applicant with an eligible site once the application opens up. There's also an emphasis on our existing grantees to make sure that they have a significant spend before they can apply for more money, just because on the 2-year cycle, we really need to get the money spent as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. We are looking for sites for the round 2 in the highest Cal Enviroscore screen areas. We're really looking for high impact projects that really provide substantial benefits to the community once they are built or finished or implemented. We want to know that our funding is critical to moving forward, and we really would love the opportunity to work with more tribes and get a much broader footprint of geography. Equitable development commitments and metrics are really important to us. For those of you familiar with our application, that is something that we're going to build out a lot more so that we can really delve into the end uses of the money that we are investing in the communities. Next slide, please. We've got a lot of information and we're putting out a lot of tools to help you build the best application possible. This is the second of our Brownfields Basics series. There's some typos here that we'll correct before we send the slides out. There's a webinar on regulatory oversight agreements and some of the new requirements that we're going to have as part of the ECRG. And we're really excited about launching the self-check tool in late October. The applications will open up in January. The deadline will be in March. We'll probably have our decisions released in June and use that period to get into agreements. When the agreements are executed, that basically is the date that expenditures are allowable and when we'll start reimbursing. Next slide, please. There's just a lot of information here. I think that's more for you to go through in your own time. I just want to emphasize that we have a 1-page snapshot on round 2. This will be hyperlinked on the slide, so you can take a look at that and really get a high-level understanding of what round 2 is about. So the best way to prepare for the ECRG application is to use the resources we have on our website. When the eligibility self-check tool comes out, please use that so that you can get the information needed for the application, gather the documents that you need, because oftentimes, especially from our experience from last time, we realize that that's really where most of the time is spent. We want you to participate in our webinars and really work with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, who is our Brownfield Technical Assistance Provider. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Claire, who can talk a little bit more about how you can get free assistance.
Thanks, Marianne. So this is just a summary of how CClear can assist you both specifically on ECRG as the BTAP provider, but also on your other land reuse inquiries through our technical assistance to Brownfields provider cooperative agreement with the EPA for EPA regions 9 and 10. So I won't go through everything on the slide, but I do want to highlight a couple points of all of the blue. Those are live links. So when you do get these slides, go ahead and click on those. Learn more about ECRG, set up an appointment to speak directly with a ECRG technical assistance provider about your potential project. Contact ECRG through the email here, and definitely for both ECRG and other CClear related updates and information, subscribe and sign up to the mailing letter and newsletters. That's one of the best ways that you can stay informed on funding opportunities, land reuse updates, case studies that might be interesting to you, all of that. And I also want to call out the what Noemi was mentioning about the multi-purpose assessment revolving loan cleanup grants, the MARC grants that are in open solicitation right now. Those are due November 22nd. CClear is reviewing those applications right now. The sooner you get us your application, the better. And there is a link here to learn more. Lou Jane, if you want to just go ahead and pop that into the chat. And we have a few minutes left here. And Rashi, I see your question here. If you want to go ahead and email info@cclear.org with your questions about the EPA MARC grant program, we can work with you on that. So some questions that we received. Some of these questions were responded to in the chat. I'll invite all of our speakers, Ignacio, Greg, Marianne, Noemi, to come back on. Is there anything we want to discuss further in these last few minutes? We had a couple questions on assessing soil and engaging the community in that from Christina Bambino. Some questions on addressing property owners' concerns from Rashi. And then from Bob Meadows, some questions about what a phase one entails. So if there's anybody who wants to jump in on those questions, I'm going to actually go ahead and pop all of that back into the chat so they're close and everybody can see them. Okay, just so our speakers can see those good questions, those good discussion questions over again.
Sure, I can jump in. I'll just go ahead and go in reverse order because Bob's question is the easiest. So to do the question is, do I need to do a phase one environmental test in my city-owned property to determine if it's contaminated? And I mean, not necessarily. We usually recommend phase ones because it gives a lot of information on background and may help you define a better sampling protocol for your property, but it's not something that is required when you're, self-directing work at your site. And let's see, the other question I see from Roshi, how do you address property owners' concerns that are not interested in getting involved with the program because they think it's opening the Pandora's box and the brownfield funds may not cover the cost of cleanup and they'll be stuck holding the bag? Are federal properties qualified to take advantage of brownfield brownfield grants? So yeah, that's a much more complicated question. Our process is our process. That is something that we need in order for us to justify the use of this money and to make sure that we're being good stewards of the money that the legislator has given us. The questions about how the property owners deal with potential liability, that's something is unfortunately we cannot get into. And at least for the ECRG, federally owned properties are not eligible. But I'll have Noemi answer the question about federally owned properties for her money as well.
So I think Ignacio responded in the chat. Federally owned properties are not eligible for our resources, nor are funds that are sites that are listed on the national priorities list. So once they, as Ignacio mentioned, the comments, once those sites have been transferred and they've been transferred with the proper due diligence as part of that transfer, then they could be eligible for US EPA funding.
Thank you. And I think that Sebastian already answered Christina's question about equitable community training and how to assess soil. That's a little bit outside of the bounds of the ECRG. One of the programs that I mentioned that's part of CVCI, it's called the Technical Assistance Grants, that may be a better fit for the kind of work that Christina is envisioning. That program is not quite built out yet, but if you visit our CVCI website, they do have frequent updates there, and that might be, I think, a much better fit.
Yeah, there's a question regarding
Yeah. Yeah,
tribal
I see
lands.
that. Does
Yeah,
the,
go ahead.
does the federal lands requirement also apply to tribal lands for EPA funding? It does not. So tribal lands are eligible, as I mentioned, in the eligibility of who can apply. Tribal lands are included in that, and under circle of liability, tribes are not considered as individuals, so they are not held liable for the contamination on those lands.
Okay. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. We threw a lot of information at you. Again, this recording and this slide deck will be shared with you post-broadcast. We may need to make a couple tweaks so you get the most accurate version. And we encourage you to reach out to us if some questions come to mind. I know that when I learned some information for the first time, I'm a bit too overwhelmed to answer, to ask questions. So please don't hesitate to contact us after you do a little bit more research and digging. With that, I think we'll conclude this webinar. Thank you again, Marianne, Noemi, Ignacio, all of the support staff for putting in some great comments and links throughout this presentation. All of those will also be available to you. And we hope that we can connect with you in the future. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.